Let's talk about training frequency, not from the bro science perspective, but from the standpoint of real, measurable muscle growth. You see, people often get stuck on the question, how many times per week should I train each muscle? Some swear by once-a-week body part splits. Others are convinced that you need to hit every muscle daily to grow. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the middle, and it's rooted in physiology, not opinion. Here's the deal. Muscle growth isn't magic, it's biology. When you train a muscle, you create microscopic damage in the fibers, a signal to your body that says, hey, we need to rebuild stronger. That signal, called muscle protein synthesis, stays elevated for around 24 to 72 hours, depending on your recovery, nutrition, and training intensity. Once that window closes, growth signaling drops back down. Now, if you only train that muscle once a week, you're leaving 4 to 5 days with no growth signal happening. That's like watering your plants once and expecting them to thrive all week. You can imagine the result: slower progress, less total stimulus, and wasted potential. On the other hand, training too frequently, smashing the same muscle every single day, creates another problem. Your body doesn't get enough time to recover. You're just beating up a system that's already inflamed and fatigued. So the goal isn't to train as often as possible, it's to train as often as you can recover from. That's the sweet spot for hypertrophy. For most people, that's around 2 to 3 times per week per muscle group. This frequency allows you to stimulate growth regularly, accumulate enough training volume, and still recover effectively between sessions. It's the perfect middle ground between stimulus and recovery, the two pillars of hypertrophy. And here's where it gets interesting. The quality of your training within that frequency matters more than just checking boxes. If you're half-assing your sets or not pushing close to failure, you could train 5 days a week and still not grow. But if your sessions are focused, controlled, and executed with progressive overload, you can achieve more with less. Optimal frequency isn't about following a trend. It's about understanding your physiology, your recovery rate, your sleep, your nutrition, all of it. You're not a machine. You're an adaptive organism. Some people grow best on 3 full-body sessions a week. Others need a higher split to manage volume and fatigue. The goal is to find that balance, where your performance and recovery align. That's where hypertrophy thrives. So if you're chasing muscle growth, stop asking, what's the perfect number of days? And start asking, how often can I train this muscle well enough to recover and grow again? Because hypertrophy doesn't care about your schedule. It cares about stimulus, recovery, and consistency. That's the science of training frequency done right. When we talk about training frequency, we have to start with the basic biological process that drives muscle growth: muscle protein synthesis. Every time you lift weights and push your muscles close to failure, you create what we call a growth signal. It's like tapping your body on the shoulder and saying, hey, we need to make these muscle fibers a little bit bigger and stronger so we can handle this next time. That signal doesn't last forever. It's temporary, and it has a distinct timeline that your body follows. For most people, that signal, the elevated rate of muscle protein synthesis, stays high for roughly 24 to 72 hours after training. Once that time window closes, the rate of growth signaling drops back down to baseline. And when it's back to baseline, no matter how much protein you eat or how hard you hope, there's no new growth stimulus happening. That means if you're training a muscle only once a week, you're basically stimulating growth for maybe 2 or 3 days, and then for the next 4 or 5 days, that muscle is just coasting. It's not actively growing anymore. You're missing out on potential gains because you're not sending that growth signal often enough. Think of it like watering a plant. You don't dump 10 gallons of water on it once a week and expect it to flourish. You water it just enough, frequently enough, to keep it thriving. Muscles work the same way. They respond to consistent, repeated signals that tell them to adapt. Now, when you train a muscle more frequently, say 2 or 3 times a week, you're keeping that signal alive more often. You're stacking those windows of muscle protein synthesis closer together so your body stays in a more regular cycle of repair and growth. Each time you train, you're not starting from scratch. You're reinforcing the adaptation process. Over weeks and months, that adds up to more total muscle growth because you've simply given your body more opportunities to build. But here's the important part. This doesn't mean you should just train every muscle every day. Muscle protein synthesis might stay elevated for up to 3 days, but recovery processes like repairing connective tissues, replenishing glycogen, and managing systemic fatigue also take time. You can't just pile stimulus on top of stimulus without letting your body recover. When you do that, you dig a recovery hole that gets deeper and deeper until your performance starts to drop and your growth actually slows down or even reverses. So the idea isn't to train as frequently as possible, it's to train as frequently as you can recover from. That's the real key. If you train a muscle and it's still sore, or your performance on that lift is down the next time you hit it, that's a sign you didn't recover fully. That's not productive training. That's just fatigue accumulation. The sweet spot for most lifters tends to be 2 to 3 times per week per muscle group. That frequency keeps your body in that ideal cycle of stimulus and recovery, giving each muscle enough time to heal and grow before you challenge it again. Let's take a practical example. Say you're training chest. If you bench press hard on Monday, your muscle protein synthesis for your chest will spike for about 2 days, maybe until Wednesday night or Thursday morning. If you don't hit chest again until the next Monday, that's 4 or 5 days where there's no real growth signal happening. Now, imagine instead of waiting all week, you train chest again on Thursday. You give your body another chance to send that growth signal before it completely fades. You're effectively doubling your opportunities to grow each week without necessarily increasing the total amount of fatigue. Over time, this approach compounds. Let's say you're someone who trains once a week per muscle group. That's 52 growth opportunities a year. If you train twice a week, that's 104 growth opportunities. You've literally doubled your chances to signal your body to grow. Even if the effect of each session isn't huge, the accumulation of those small growth periods adds up massively over the long term. This is why frequency matters. It's about the long game of giving your body more consistent reasons to adapt. Now, everyone's recovery ability is different. Some people can handle slightly more frequent training because they recover faster, eat well, and sleep enough. Others may need a bit more time between sessions, especially if they train with very high volume or intensity. The idea is to find your personal recovery rhythm. For most intermediate to advanced lifters, that 2 to 3 times per week range per muscle is right in that sweet spot. It provides enough stimulus to keep muscle protein synthesis elevated regularly, but also enough time to fully recover and get stronger from session to session. Here's another important nuance. Training frequency doesn't replace training quality. You can't just do a quick, easy workout every day and expect to grow faster. Each session still needs to be challenging enough to generate meaningful stimulus, close to failure, good range of motion, controlled reps. Frequency amplifies effective training, but it doesn't fix lazy training. So if your sets aren't intense enough to really trigger growth, training more often just means doing more ineffective work. The foundation always has to be good, hard, smart training. So the big takeaway is that muscle growth is not about doing the most in one session. It's about doing enough, often enough, to keep your body adapting. When you understand that muscle protein synthesis only stays elevated for a short window after training, you see why frequency is so important. You're trying to time your next training bout just as your muscles are fully recovered, but before the growth signal completely disappears. That's how you stay in that continuous cycle of growth and repair. If you can find that rhythm, train hard, recover fully, and stimulate again before the signal fades, you'll be amazed at how much faster your physique progresses. It's not about how sore you feel or how exhausted you are after a workout. It's about how consistently you can apply an effective stimulus. That's the science behind optimal training frequency. It's about understanding how your body's growth signals work and using that timing to your advantage. When you do, you're not just training harder, you're training smarter. One of the biggest mistakes people make when chasing hypertrophy is thinking that more is always better. They assume that if training twice a week is good, then 5 or 6 times must be great. But biology doesn't care about your ambition. It only responds to what it can recover from. Optimal training frequency isn't about doing as much as possible. It's about finding that balance between giving your muscles enough stimulus to grow and enough time to recover so that growth can actually happen. That balance, the dance between stimulus and recovery, is where real hypertrophy lives. Think of it this way. When you train, you're not building muscle in the gym. You're creating controlled damage, micro tears in muscle fibers, mechanical tension, metabolic stress. All of that sends a powerful message to your body. We need to rebuild stronger. But that rebuilding doesn't happen during the workout. It happens during rest, sleep, and nutrition. That's recovery. If you disrupt that recovery by training again too soon, your body doesn't get the chance to complete the rebuilding process. You're basically tearing down the walls before the construction crew finishes fixing them. Over time, that leads to stagnation, fatigue, and even regression. On the other hand, Training too little, giving your body tons of recovery, but not enough stimulus, is just as unproductive. Imagine stimulating growth once a week and then sitting back waiting for miracles. By the time your next session comes, that growth signal has long faded and your body has no reason to keep adapting. You're understimulating the system. You're technically recovering, sure, but there's nothing to recover from. That's why people who train once a week per muscle group often spin their wheels. They feel like they're working hard, but their progress crawls because the signal for growth just isn't frequent enough. So, what we're really talking about is finding that perfect middle ground, the sweet spot where stimulus and recovery overlap. You want to train often enough to keep sending that growth signal, but not so often that you're constantly digging into recovery resources your body hasn't replenished yet. When you hit that balance, everything clicks. Your performance improves, your energy stays high, and your muscles actually have the resources to grow. Now, let's be clear, this balance point isn't the same for everyone. It depends on your training volume, your intensity, your sleep, your nutrition, your genetics, even your stress levels outside the gym. If you're training with high volume, a lot of sets, a lot of near-failure work, you'll need more recovery days before you can train that muscle effectively again. If you're doing lower volume but very focused sessions, you might be able to handle a higher frequency. The body's recovery systems are adaptable, but they're not infinite. The better you manage fatigue, the more often you can train productively. A good way to visualize this is with a simple curve. Imagine stimulus on one side and fatigue on the other. After you train, your fatigue goes up and your performance temporarily drops. Over the next couple of days, recovery kicks in, fatigue drops, and your muscle repairs and adapts. Then if you wait too long, that adaptation decays and you're back to baseline. The goal is to hit your next training session right when your body has recovered, but before that adaptation starts to fade. That's when your muscle is primed to grow again. If you train too early, fatigue still lingers. If you wait too long, you lose momentum. Hitting that timing repeatedly, that's optimal frequency. And here's where most people go wrong. They either train way too hard too often and wonder why they're sore, exhausted, and stuck, or they train so infrequently that their muscles forget what hard work even feels like. The smartest lifters understand that hypertrophy is a long game. It's about sustainability, about being able to train hard week after week, month after month, without burning out. The person who trains smart, balances stress and recovery, and stays consistent over time will always outperform the one who goes all out for a few weeks and crashes. You also have to remember that recovery isn't just about resting. It's an active process that includes good sleep, proper nutrition, hydration, managing stress, and intelligent programming. You could train 3 times a week perfectly on paper, but if you're sleeping 4 hours a night and eating like a bird, you're not recovering. And your results will show it. Likewise, someone who's dialed in with recovery can sometimes handle slightly more frequency because their system is ready for it. So frequency is deeply personal. It's not a one-size-fits-all number. It's an individualized balance between how hard you train and how well you recover. Now, let's think practically. For most people, training each muscle group 2 to 3 times a week hits that balance well. It allows enough stimulus to keep growth signaling active and enough downtime to rebuild stronger. For example, if you hit your legs on Monday and Thursday, you're giving them 2 or 3 days to recover before you go again. You're staying right inside that sweet spot of muscle protein synthesis, keeping the adaptation cycle moving forward. If you trained legs every day, you'd be wrecked and your performance would tank. If you trained legs only once a week, you'd be leaving 4 or 5 days with zero growth signaling. 2 or 3 times a week keeps that adaptation loop rolling without overwhelming your system. This balance is the heart of smart training. It's what separates those who make steady, predictable gains from those who burn out or stall. And the beautiful thing about this principle is that it applies at every level: beginner, intermediate, advanced. Beginners might recover a bit faster because their absolute loads are lower, while advanced lifters might need a bit more recovery because they're moving serious weight. But the underlying rule doesn't change. Stimulate, recover, repeat. That's the loop you want to stay in. So when we talk about optimal frequency, what we're really saying is this: hypertrophy thrives on balance. It's not about punishing your body every day or giving it endless rest. It's about finding that rhythm where each muscle is trained often enough to grow, but not so often that you're just piling stress on top of stress. When you find that rhythm, when your stimulus and recovery are perfectly in sync, your body rewards you with steady, reliable progress. You get stronger, bigger, and better, not because you did more or less, but because you did it right.